Everyone, hi. Welcome to another session of American Public Policy Redux. We're so happy you're with us today. And what is today? Thursday, October 22nd, 2020. Tonight's the last of the debates, which we're very excited about. And as always, this is being recorded, so on active speaker view. So if you choose to speak, you will be recorded. If you choose not to speak, you can always submit your comments in the chat box and I'll read them for you, or your questions in the chat box and I can read them for you. And as always, if you have any questions, clarifications, need an additional example, etc., just jump on in, unmute yourself and ask Pat directly. And that's it. We're going to jump on in. Go ahead, Pat.
Good. I'm going to start. I'll start out with trivia. Does anybody know whose birthday October 20th was? See, I have to know because it's my wife's birthday, but it's also Kamala Harris's birthday. It is also, I don't think, oh, you got it, Paige. It is also, I have a former student and she's been unable to sign in because she's been doing stuff related to the election. It's her birthday as well, and her middle name is Aileen. The icing on the cake is it's also Snoop Dogg's birthday. Okay, so first of all, if I look annoyed, it's because now it's basketball practice and they're doing timed drills and the time is 1 minute. So every minute there's going to be a blankety blank air horn that goes off. So if I get really, really irritated, that's my excuse. Here's what I plan to do. Sort of two discrete things, okay? One is to talk about the lost opportunities we had as a nation to deal with partisan polarization, okay? And then I would like to get us back to where we intended to go in the first place. And that is to think about how the change that we have documented, and there's no doubt about it. There's no doubt that partisan polarization has increased dramatically from the 1980s to the present. Then how do we adapt? How do we change the way that we understand the policymaking? And I'm looking at a model, and by a model, I want you to think about that that triangle, okay, that portrayed the sub-government. So it identified the key actors, and it also said something about how they interacted with each other and why they interacted in that way. In addition, what we couldn't put on there were the outside actors and explanations for why they might get involved successfully or unsuccessfully. So that's the direction I would like to go. And I have an idea that I want to pose at the end. And the closing will be, okay, for next week, think about how reasonable you think that revised kind of model is. And if you have different ideas about how we might better develop a model, a comprehensive model that would help us understand why the policymaking process works the way that it does now. Okay? Is that clear to everybody about, it's two discrete things, so it's a little, okay. Okay, so that process of partisan polarization, it's pretty clear. Like, this is not something that political scientists disagree about. It starts with presidents, with particular presidents, and it moves to the elite level, House and Senate, and then it moves to the public. And I kind of dealt with that first connection from the president to the House and Senate last time. I don't know that there's any point in going over the research that talks about how it moved to the public. I gave you a little hint about what that would look like by mentioning that landmark study by John Zoller, Zaller, that provides evidence that that's the way that public opinion works. But I don't think it's something we want to spend a whole lot of time on. Okay. So the first thing I want to deal with is noting that we didn't have to end up in this cesspool. It didn't have to be the case that we saw ever increasing levels of partisan polarization. And in fact, there were two discrete opportunities we had to pull back from the abyss. Okay. The engines for moving partisan polarization forward came from Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush. And again, solid empirical evidence that's the case. They were significantly more conservative in the way they conducted their presidency than preceding Republican presidents. And on the other hand, the more recent Democratic presidents have been more moderate than some of the older Democratic presidents, notably Harry Truman, okay, whom nobody thinks of as a flaming liberal, okay? But I didn't do anything to explain why that was the case. And I think it's interesting to see that as well. The starting point on that, I think, is, I'm going to give you a couple little things there. So who ran as the Democratic candidate for president in 1972? And no fair chatting. If you're going to guess out loud. 1972. Ran against Nixon.
McGovern?
Congratulations, Adrian, you win the prize.
Yeah.
Okay. And 1976, this will be the easy one.
Carter.
Jimmy Carter. Okay. McGovern and then Carter. McGovern was probably one of the most liberal candidates the Democrats have ever run. Okay. And what happens? He gets absolutely slaughtered in the 1972 election. Okay. Absolutely slaughtered. And then Carter comes back and wins. I may have talked to some of you about this at other times, but candidates and politicians are not always the brightest crayons in the box. And sometimes they draw lessons from events that are unwarranted, okay? But the lesson that Democratic candidates drew, you know what, let me add one more element, okay? The other thing is late 60s, early 70s, you saw really remarkable radicalization of the left. Okay, I actually have a current student who's been dropping by to talk to me about research that she's doing on Students for a Democratic Society, and she's getting into the Weather Underground. So the left at that point actually started like bombing stuff. It had really, and no, McGovern didn't have a woman vice president.
No, it was Ferraro was the first, Geraldine Ferraro was the first female vice president. Yeah.
So the left, in a sense, it's not perfect, but the left had become so ideological that it had gone off the deep end and it started embracing violence the way the right has been doing recently. Again, I mean, that's my big crusade right now, is death to ideology, because it drove the left off the deep end in the late 60s, early 70s, and it's driven the right off the deep end more recently. So you're going into the early 70s, mid 70s, and that's the environment. Well, you know what? Democratic candidates and elites started deciding, McGovern, liberal, loser. Carter, conservative, winner. we need to run campaigns in the center. We need to make the party more conservative if we want to win national elections. And tellingly, a really influential, important group formed, started, I think I posted the thing on Facebook about the Democratic Leadership Council, and one of its founders is Al Frome, who's from the area. Guess who else was deeply involved in the DLC? Bill Clinton.
I was this close.
Bill Clinton, okay? What it meant, it's not as though, I mean, we talked about how primaries can attract more extremist voters. Democratic primaries didn't stop having that property. You continued to overrepresent more liberal folks within the party in those primaries. It happened at the elite level. Potential candidates would decide that if they had a record that was more liberal, it probably wasn't a good idea to think about running for the presidency. Okay, because that sort of common wisdom was, you can't win. You know, you might get the nomination, but you're not going to win, and it's an arduous process. So why would you do that? On top of that, Mondale, who was a sort of traditional Democrat, liberal, but not way out there, he gets killed by Reagan in 1984. So you have this abundant evidence that you need to start moving to the center. That's the lesson getting learned by Democratic candidates, okay? And Bill Clinton is the best illustration to that point. This boy is no liberal. You don't, I hope folks enjoyed the links there that I left on Facebook. You really ought to take a look at those things to get a sense of just where he was coming from. He got shaped additionally by his experience as governor of Arkansas. You know, a really, really, really conservative state, where he had to scale back an awful lot of what he wanted to do so that he could be successful politically in Arkansas. One of the, I couldn't really post it there. How many of you have seen Ava DuVernay's film 13th? Oh, and it's you can see the whole thing on YouTube. And her argument is that the 13th Amendment is sort of intimately tied, the way that it got worded, is intimately tied with mass incarceration. And two characters with starring roles are the Clintons, okay? They were really tied to a number of the, you know, get tough on drugs initiatives, and just the cultural conservative of the conservatism of the Clinton administration. I mean, I think it's really just incredibly clear that he was at the center. He did reverse some of Reagan's tax cuts, but particularly on like cultural, social, morality kinds of policies, he was right there with the Republicans lots of times, okay?
Including
So
NAFTA, Pat, right? Including
I'm sorry?
NAFTA. Including
Yeah,
NAFTA.
that's an excellent example. Yeah, thanks, man. That's terrific. There are just tons of those kinds of things. Oh, let me make one kind of side point. Republicans never had to learn, quote, learn that being too conservative would pay a price, because Karl Rove was awesome at getting out the Republican base. So even though long term, it's a losing strategy in the general election, they kept thinking they could push it off, and you could continue to have really very conservative candidates who could be successful. Okay, let's go back to Clinton. Clinton really did move the party to the center. But the Republican response was not exactly the old, okay, well, you came some distance, we'll come. No. Instead, you get Newt. This is for everybody. Are you ready? You get Newty's contract with America. And granted, that was all about personal ambition. It wasn't about democratic rule. He didn't care about the Republican Party. That was all about personal ambition. But it didn't matter because it took the Republican Party ever farther away from the more moderate position that Clinton was taking. And then you impeach him. And you impeach him over an extramarital affair. Not really what the framers had in mind when they wrote sections on impeachment, okay? It's something that everybody who was involved ought to be embarrassed that they did. And notably, public opinion actually responded in a corresponding fashion. Yeah, but it's a trivial stupid case. It's a trivial stupid case. If it's perjury about something that matters, that's public, that's one thing. But no. Nobody's ever going to convince me that that was a legitimate use of impeachment powers. In a sense, it didn't matter in that that was one way that you continued to take Clinton reaching across the aisle and slap him on the knuckles. Okay. And the public responded accordingly. His approval ratings increased. The public as a whole kind of recognized that this was bogus. It was just a really silly kind of thing. So, but that was one opportunity. You had a Democratic president who actually visibly, markedly moved to the middle. I watched him get booed at a campaign appearance. It was my younger daughter's first political experience, and we caught him. The 1996 convention was in Chicago, and he was doing a whistle stop tour going in. So I took my little daughter. She's up on my shoulders. Bill Clinton is like 2 hours late, like he always was. This is right after he did welfare reform, which we can add on. Okay? Yeah. So he starts his speech and he mentions something about welfare reform, and the crowd boos him.
I remember all that.
Yeah.
I mean, there were administration officials who resigned from the Department of Health and Human Services because he took away the entitlement. He eliminated the entitlement for welfare.
Yeah.
I mean, it was hugely controversial.
Yeah. So it's just, there's all of that evidence that he really opened the door to providing an opportunity to scale back partisan polarization. Okay. And you could, I think you all know, I hate Bill Clinton. Nonetheless, you got to give the boy credit for trying to deal. I mean, he did it out of personal ambition too. But it was an opportunity so that we didn't have to go deeply into the abyss. But the response wasn't coming from Republican Party leadership. And Newt Gingrich, Newty, bears an awful lot of responsibility for taking that opportunity and just throwing it away. If folks had more of a sense of the importance of public morality as opposed to private morality, Newt Gingrich would have been run out of town on a rail. In terms of public morality, he has been one of the most immoral actors in American politics over the last few decades. So that doesn't happen then. The next opportunity comes with Obama. And I always thought it was funny during the course of the campaign, all of my liberal friends would go, oh, he's really, really liberal. I go, you're not reading. You're not reading he really had fairly moderate ideas. The rhetoric kind of sounded liberal, but in terms of what he actually had in mind to do, not so much. And then even once he got into office, it wasn't nearly as liberal. One of the ways you can see that illustrated is that Black electoral support for Obama dropped from his first election to his re-election campaign. Significant portions of the African-American community thought of Obama as kind of a traitor, that he let the Black community down, that he wasn't doing all those liberal kinds of things that they thought he was going to do. Okay, but if you actually paid attention, you should have known he wasn't going off the deep end in liberal terms. But now he's confronting an even more polarized situation than Clinton did. Significantly more polarized situation. And I'm not averse to saying that race may well have been part of this as well, okay? Okay, so what happens on the Republican side? My second candidate for public immorality in America, the Public Immorality Prize, we need to come up with a prize, like have a name for it and start awarding it, is Mitch McConnell. And Mitch McConnell has tried to pull back from the statement that he made about making Obama a one-term president. Go back and read it. If you read it, he talks about he's going to be a one-term president if he fails to do the following kinds of things. And he talks about meeting the Republican Party halfway. And then he spins that out a little more. And if you read it, his idea of coming halfway to the Republican Party is agreeing with the Republican Party. If you're willing to agree with the Republican Party, we can work with you. So the weasel words that he wanted to use later, I don't care. I don't care. You've made it very, very clear that you have no interest in cooperating with Obama, in negotiating with him, regardless of what distance you have there. This is a president who's made it clear that he made repeated comments about trying to work with Republicans. There was a joke going around Washington, and that it was, what's the easiest way to get FaceTime with Barack Obama? And the punchline was, be a Republican. He was trying to make contacts with Republicans in Congress. Again, he's more conservative than Truman. This was another opportunity to pull back from the abyss. Now, again, you had some complicating factors. You had the blasted Tea Party. And then later on, you had the formation of the House Freedom Caucus. And those were like, take no prisoner, folks. We're not negotiating, we're not compromising, we're sticking to our principles. But it does mean that we lost that opportunity. I'm going to additionally point out that there was still enough range within the Democratic Party that you had characters like Joe Lieberman shooting down essentially Harry Truman's idea for national health insurance, to do single provider, which would have been much cleaner, and it would have it would have saved us from going through all of these court cases about Obamacare. Lieberman essentially exercised veto power so that they couldn't even proceed with that as an alternative. Appreciate that. That means of the proposals that Obama was going to try to move forward, he took the most liberal proposal off the board. And still what happens? You get, I think in the House, you got 1 vote among Republicans for Obamacare. It's not just that. I think you all know where Obamacare came from. It was Romney Care.
Yeah.
It was Romney Care, and Mitt Romney later on admitted it. Appreciate the perversity of that action. Republicans vote en masse against a proposal a member of their own party put into effect just to oppose the Democratic president who's there, with a Democratic president who's trying to reach across the aisle. Again, those forces of partisan polarization had become much more extreme for Obama than they were for Clinton. But I think it's just incredibly striking what happened in that process. It's just the most insane thing that you can possibly imagine. To go back to Reagan and W, I don't think that they intentionally increased partisan polarization. To be blunt, neither one of them is that smart. They're not going to have the foresight to think about this. It just kind of came naturally. And to be honest, they had members of their administrations who were farther out to the right than they were. Okay. But nonetheless, it moved forward. And I'm not even bother getting into Trump, because at this point, partisan polarization is sort of what it was during Obama. And then what you're layering on top with Trump, it has no policy content. It's not as though he's pursuing real, he's doing executive orders, but he's just tweeting stuff all the time and making declarations and engaging in rallies, and all of that stuff is firing up partisan polarization. Okay, that was does that make sense in terms of, I really, once again, I'm ending with a downer, but though I see those as 2 tragic moments in recent American politics, that we didn't have to go where we went. We had an opportunity to veer away from that path, and we lost them. And that's given what's happened to our politics and our policymaking system, that's a tragedy of epic proportions that costs lives across the country and around the world. Okay. I want to now get into the policymaking thing and how this has been hitting the policymaking process. And I want to spin out like a few examples, and I've mentioned them. I've mentioned most of them before, but I want to list them so that can perhaps help in understanding how we might want to change our model. Okay. And the first one is just because it's so much fun. The first is Nudie. And all the power that he gathered around his position as Speaker of the House, where he would just bypass the committee and subcommittee system. I'm mentioning that because the committee and subcommittee system played the key role in the old model of policymaking, okay? So you had party in the person of Newt Gingrich, just sweeping the committee system and therefore subgovernment politics aside when he felt like it. Okay. The second thing is the business with Obamacare. Just the stark nature of that you vote against it, even though your party initially proposed it, because now the other party is proposing it. The third one that I would, given time enough, we would do a lot of, is the budgetary process. And I know that I did a fair amount of this in that old course where we contrasted the classic budgetary process to the new budgetary process. And I just want to hit a couple of elements, again, hopefully to help make this point. And by the way, the budgetary process was perhaps the first part of the engine that drives things off the rail. And it was a conscious decision on the part of the Reagan administration to stake all of their political capital when they're coming into the White House on drastically changing the nature of the budget. Okay. How did they do that? The concept of the base, which played such a key role in the old policymaking system, in the classic budgetary process. And just to review, the base was essentially the status quo. It's you keep doing what you're doing, you make adjustments for inflation, but it's the status quo. And the reason the base has value pertains to information and a recognition that human capacities and human knowledge are limited. So you don't know, when you introduce a new program and it costs X million dollars, you could have all the arguments about why it will be successful and why it will have certain kinds of consequences. Truth is, you don't know. You just don't know. Life's complicated. You don't know. Well, but what you do know is if we spend X number of dollars on activities A through F, we got these outcomes. So if we tinker with them, then we work on the basis of that knowledge. It means we won't make big mistakes. We won't have big successes, but we won't have big mistakes. Okay, we're not going to have disasters. The base got torn up. In fairness, dumbass Jimmy Carter tried to move in this direction because he wanted to introduce from Georgia zero-based budgeting. What he didn't understand was it was a lot easier to dress up your. I was going to try and think of a metaphor, but I'm just don't know. You're dressing up one thing to look like it's zero-based budgeting, but you're really using the old process. And that's what
it's called you can put lipstick on a pig, but it's still a lipstick.
No, I didn't want to do that. You're mean, Anne. So, I mean, it was first kind of introduced by Jimmy Carter, but he didn't really follow through with it. Reagan completely obliterated the notion of the base and wanted agencies and departments to identify, and they weren't going to identify them. He knew what good programs were, and he knew what bad programs were on the basis of his ideology. Okay, and so if it was a bad program, then you shouldn't be spending any money on that program. The base should be zero in a bad program. Again, there were ways in which agencies and committees on appropriations could drag their heels on that and not go as far as Reagan wanted to take them, but that was where he was moving things. The second thing is just the role played by agencies in the budgetary process. In the old process, agencies were the most important players on the basis of their knowledge. They had more knowledge about the programs being run and their consequences than anybody else. Anybody. Okay. When they have a really important role, that means information plays a very important role in the process. And everyone agreed that that information mattered. I don't know if you remember this, but I think in at least one of the books that I used on the budgetary process, in one of the interviews, the member of Congress said, if an agency comes in here and they start making an emotional case for their appropriation, it means they're weak. It means they don't have an argument. They don't have evidence to support their case. In the absence of evidence, that's all you can do, okay? Those things illustrate just how important information expertise, information played in that old system. Now, instead, with the new process, Reagan wanted his director of the Office of Management and Budget to drive things. Okay, so we always have to throw in a few trivia things. So who was Reagan's first OMB director? He's from nearby me, here now.
I so should know this.
Nobody?
Um,
Famous article in Atlantic, well, back then it was Atlantic Monthly, now it's just Atlantic. No, it's not.
Stock, no.
Pardon?
Stock something.
You know what you've done? You put elements of his first and last name together into one thing.
Okay, what is it?
So pull them apart. David Stockman. David Stockman. He wanted David Stockman to drive what was going. So one of David Stockman's tasks involved getting the agencies to get in line. Okay. And that's an interesting, maybe I'll run that down. Well, you wouldn't, I don't know that you have access to it. It was a James Fallows interview with David Stockman. David Stockman, he may be one of the brightest OMB directors we've ever had, but he also had an ego the size of Texas. He loved sort of talking about himself and how smart he was. And well, if you're a good journalist, you can play those guys. You can play them. And Fallows sort of brought him in and kind of stroked him along there and got him to the point where David Stockman goes, I don't know what the numbers mean. I don't know what's going on. This, of course, was the last thing Reagan wanted to hear, and Reagan kind of took him to the woodshed on that. But the more important point for our purposes, it illustrates that information and expertise had become devalued. Instead, it was values. The values and the ideology that Reagan wanted to put into place said, well, things like welfare are bad. Things like you can just sort of go through all the things. On the other hand, military spending was great. And so military spending went way through the roof, okay? But not on the basis of evidence, not on the basis of information and expertise. Instead, it was speculation and ideology. And that dramatically changes things. And how many of you remember the budgetary bucks game? Simulation?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I'm kind of proud of that. It's hard to put together simulations, and I thought, boy, I nailed it with this one. One of the places where folks started to break down that reflected the political situation they lived in was if they were on one of the appropriations subcommittees, they would participate as Republicans or Democrats when party didn't make that big a difference. Okay? They were generally finding consensus across party lines. Okay? It was rare that you would have stark party divisions. Okay? Mind you, one of the reasons was that if they could achieve consensus, then they knew that consensus would be approved by the House and the Senate. In other words, they'd have an impact. Okay. Well, now the behavior on appropriations and budget is intensely partisan. Republicans line up on one side, Democrats line up on the other. Okay.
Hey,
Okay,
Pat,
so
when did you say that military spending was through the roof with Reagan? Because I thought that
80s.
wasn't there like, I don't know, I feel like in the late 80s though, there was like big military cuts in spending, like 86, 87.
That's after he leaves.
Oh.
Right.
That's the fall of the Soviet Union.
Oh.
That happens when George H.W. Bush is there. And then you get the peace dividend,
Right.
which I'm recalling the public policy course for you all, that provided the opportunity to start reducing the deficits that Reagan accumulated because of all that spending. Because the peace dividend meant, wow, there was this incredible level of spending for the military. And then suddenly there was no reason to spend all that money because the Soviet Union was gone.
Okay.
Cool.
All right.
Okay.
Right, but military spending has remained fairly high for quite a while.
There have been ups and downs. It was important at that point in time that it went down, and
under George W., I mean, we had the the war. I mean,
I know.
It's been fairly high. Yeah.
But we dropped it, and we had opportunities to keep it low, and we lost those opportunities too.
Political polarization.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So here's my modest proposal, with apologies to Swift. Here's one way we could think about this. We could think about these sort of two discrete models of policymaking with a switch. Okay. And the switch does this particular policy proposal fit into the framework of partisan conflict? Okay. If it doesn't fit in to that framework of partisan conflict, policymaking looks like the old system, because the parties haven't lined up on opposing sides yet. Okay. Part of what I'm getting at too is this is the kind of thing that it wasn't like night and day. You've seen over time more and more issues get put into this system of partisan conflict. And like masks is the reductio ad absurdum of it all, right? But you certainly have had over time a number of issues that really didn't fit in completely. And you can, things, and to different degrees, right? And that's what makes this a little messier. So there are a lot of infrastructure things that there are a bunch of infrastructure proposals. My bet is you could get Republicans and Democrats on board, and you wouldn't have that kind of partisan conflict. But we may be losing that opportunity because they cost money. Okay, and if the Republican Party then just says, well, anything that costs money that's not the military or police functions, we're against that, then that can fall in. But I wanted to give you an idea that there's gray area. Okay. And there are still some issues that don't fit into that model. They don't get a lot of press because they don't involve conflict. which means they're not a story for a journalist. They're not interesting, they're not entertaining, okay? If, on the other hand, the proposal does fit into that system of party conflict, then the old system just goes right out the window in a radical way, because you're shifting the locus of power from the inside subgovernmental actors to one outside political actor. And I think in this other model, you then, instead of having the triangle, you just choose up sides. So you can go through every single participant, and if they want to have an impact, they have to line up on one side of the partisan divide or the other. They have to identify as essentially an interest group that supports the Republican Party or an interest group that supports the Democratic Party. And all of those members of committees in the House and the Senate, they've got to line up with their team, with their tribe, and there's no kind of cross. And if you're going back and forth, there are disincentives to that. You'll pay a price with party leadership if you don't go along on those party votes. Things like losing position on the committee that you wanted, losing leadership position on the committee that you want, okay? And you can go through all of those actors, okay, and see, well, they're gonna have to line up on one side or the other. Here's my punchline on that. Who can't? Who can't line up on one side or the other? If you think about all the actors that we've got the subgovernmental actors, we got the outside actors, who can't line up on one side or the other? You got an idea? Anybody?
Well, the agencies probably are in a really tough spot, yeah?
Yeah, you got it. You got it. I get the perversity of this. The sources of information and expertise are like, yeah, no.
The agencies are like done. That's a good point. They're like sick of all this.
Yeah, they absolutely are. And I think, to get argumentative about it, that all the rhetoric that comes out that vilifies folks in government agencies just makes me so angry that these are folks who are really committed to public service. They're making huge sacrifices so that they can contribute to public service in America, and we're slamming them. We're vilifying that, not we, but there are folks who are doing that. And in terms of the effectiveness of our policymaking process, and again, I don't care where the policy goes, but have information and expertise drive the discussion. Well, we're going to take them out. We're going to take them out. And the only sources of expertise that we have are interest groups who have a particular point of view. And remember, if the party is driving it, they don't care. They don't care. They simply want the interest group to line up on their side. Maybe do an ad campaign, but it's taking information and expertise out of the process. Okay, so I'm gonna reiterate this because I know that I kind of wandered around a little bit. Let me reiterate what I have in mind in terms of putting this together in a new model. Okay, is that now we have essentially two different models of policymaking. One model looks like our old model. And if the issue doesn't fit into the structure of partisan conflict, that's the way that things work. And that's become increasingly less important, less prevalent. But if it does fit into partisan conflict, then you sweep all that aside, and instead you simply have two sides. And you can put all of the actors that might get engaged in a given policymaking process, either on the Democratic side or the Republican side. And if they're not on one of those sides, they simply don't matter as much. They're less relevant. Okay? Does that have some degree of clarity to it?
Leslie had a
Yeah,
follow-up.
It
Go ahead.
does. I don't want to get us off track, but so I really do follow what you're saying. I'm trying to make heads or tails about that and how that applies, because I think a lot of what's happened at the national level gets imitated at the state level. In
Yes.
Georgia, we have had a Republican governor, Senate, and House for years, and information still doesn't matter, even though ideologically they should all be somewhat aligned. You know what I mean? So I was thinking, well, maybe they'd go back to the old system because now they're really interested in facts and, you know, getting
Yeah.
into expertise. But it doesn't, my experience is that is not the case.
Yeah, and Leslie, this is Ann. I feel what they do is they cherry pick. They cherry pick information.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's to go back to the term that I placed in a central location in the old theory. It's engaging in partisan analysis. It's just that the balance between the partisan part and the analysis part has shifted. But yeah, I think that the thing that's at least one thing that's different about the states is that you have a number of states, and Georgia isn't really there because Georgia is getting more competitive and there's a chance that this could shift, but you have a number of states that are just one party systems.
Well, and Georgia has been like that in the state
Right.
house, meaning you didn't need any Democratic votes to get anything through any of those
Yeah.
chambers.
Well, and what you hear from the states, and I was at a conference a couple of years ago with the National Conference of State Legislatures and spoke with someone who'd been in the system for like 30 years, Pat, observing the policymaking process.
Mhm.
And what she essentially said was, at the state level, they're mirroring what happens at the federal level.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
it was just of extreme frustration to her, who's seen
Right.
more functional systems.
Yeah, and NCSL is this really terrific organization that
They're great.
provides lots of expertise and information and assistance to states. And I mean, there's a former
And
student.
really nonpartisan. They're nonpartisan.
Right.
I mean, they're really
Right.
about, yeah,
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 my
and-
professional organization is within NCSL. They're top notch.
they're
Yeah.
really great.
Mhm.
Well, I mean, there's.
But anyway, I'm sorry, I made a
No,
Anyway,
segue
no,
to the
it's
state.
time for the debate.
Well, there we go. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. So why don't we wrap things up there, particularly if that makes sense to everybody. So think about that. And next time will be one of those things that I want to start out with you guys. That you talk about what you think about that. And I would, I think it's cool to then, let's first talk about national level, but let's go and talk about the states too. For one thing, there are an awful lot of you who have really, really great experience on the state level. And it's sort of interesting to see how things kind of percolate through federalism from the national to state. And some of you even have some experience with local.
And so just to close, so based on what you had said at the beginning was, think about how reasonable we think the idea you propose, that there is
Right.
essentially two models going on. Partisan, not partisan is the old model. If it's a partisan issue, it becomes the second model, essentially. So think about how reasonable we think that is, and we can talk about policy-making process
Yeah.
from there.
Would it help folks if I kind of provided text for that
Yeah.
two model system and posted it?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay,
yeah,
I'll
that
do
would be good.
I'll do that. In the next couple of days, I can probably put that together. Cool.
Awesome. Thank you
Great.
so much,
Thanks, Pat.
everyone.
Really
Have fun
interesting.
tonight.
Thanks, guys. Yeah.
Bye.
La la la.
Bye-bye. Good night.
Take care, all.
Bye-bye.